Over the past 10 years, the Canadian government has embarked on an experiment to upend the established order of a once celebrated immigration system and welcome into our country record numbers of people, millions and millions of new immigrants into Canada. Concerns about housing availability and infrastructure were pushed to the sidelines. Concerns about Canadian values, assimilation, and integration were shunned, often labeled as racist, as we were reminded that Canadian values don't actually exist, and we are all living in a post-national country. Well, today, over 60% of Canadians feel that Canada's immigration system is bringing in too many people. We are finally starting to have real conversations about Canadian values and integration, and it is clear to all that Canada does not have the housing capacity and infrastructure capacity to handle these record numbers. Is Canada's immigration system broken, as Pierre Poilievre tells us? Well, it kind of does look like that. So how do we go about fixing it? Well, that is the subject of a new study published by the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, titled Repairing the Fray: Improving Immigration and Citizenship Policy in Canada. Joining me now is Dr. Michael Bonner, the author of that study on immigration, a senior fellow at the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy, and a former senior policy advisor to Canada's immigration minister. Dr. Bonner, thank you for joining me. I want to first get your reaction to the news last week from IRCC, which shows that in the first 4 months of 2025, Canada brought in 817,000 new immigrants. Is the federal government actually serious about controlling population growth, as they tell us?
Well, it sounds as though they're not. And if you remember that horrible, embarrassing exchange from the minister in Parliament the other day, she clearly isn't on top of the file and doesn't understand what's going on and isn't listening to Canadians. That number, by the way, we need to know how that is actually broken down. I suspect that most of that number was, the total was 817,000 within the first quarter of this year, which is outrageous. I suspect that that number is mostly temporary immigration. And as we know, it was the temporary foreign worker program that was at the center of the most recent backlash. So I would say the government is playing with fire with numbers like this.
The point of your study really is to find a roadmap for how Canada can get back onto a normal immigration path and that it can be accepted by the broader Canadian public, something that it appears now is not the case. I want to ask you, is Canada's multiculturalism experiment, as it has been executed over the past few decades, has that failed?
Well, yeah, it has. I mean, first of all, the definition, when people say multiculturalism, they don't mean the three or more, or broadly speaking, three founding cultures of Canada. You can subdivide those more and get a couple of different cultures out of that. That isn't what people mean. What has happened is that multiculturalism has come to mean an unwillingness or a kind of indifference to integration, nation building, and even when it comes to the established population of keeping historical memory alive and stuff like that. I would, and this is all embodied in the Trudeau idea of the post-national state and the lack of any kind of cultural identity within the country. That has failed. It failed because it's largely a lie. That isn't how most Canadians think of our country, and it's certainly not how most newcomers view us. So yeah, I would say that's just, it's got to go. It was a non-starter from the beginning, and it hasn't benefited our country.
It seemed as though in the federal campaign, both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre were, acknowledging that the numbers had to come down. If you looked at what Mark Carney was saying, that number was still going to be hovering right around 400,000, and Poilievre was proposing numbers closer to the Harper era of around 250,000 permanent residents. In the study, you propose that Canada should be looking at 200,000 permanent residents a year. Um, why did you come to that number, and how did you get there?
Well, that number is just a suggestion. Uh, One of my main points of the study is that the way numbers are set by cabinet should become more transparent, and it should be subject to at least some kind of public, public input and probably parliamentary oversight also. And second, the way the numbers are presented to the public needs to change. And we saw this again with this ridiculous number, 817,000. I mean, we need to know who and what kind of immigrants are making up that number. If that's a number of, I don't know, high paid IT workers coming into a bank or something, there might be reasons to object to that. But that would be very different from low wage, low skilled workers coming to serve on a farm or at a a cannery or something like that. We need to know more about it. That's the first thing. 200,000 is a number that I think would be more easily integrated in economically and culturally, and also in terms of infrastructure. But but again, and that's simply because we did that very successfully in the Harper years and a little bit before that. That was generally speaking the number. Sometimes it went up to 250,000, but it was hovering somewhere around 200,000. We have to take into account things like infrastructure, housing, where labor shortages actually are, and prove that the labor shortages are real. It's not just the number; it's the whole sort of picture of the Canadian economy and labor market that needs to be taken into account. And so far, we haven't really been doing that very well. And you only need to think about housing. There are many other factors, but housing is the most obvious proof that we've got it wrong.
I've just been trying to understand the justification that Justin Trudeau could provide to Canadians, because he didn't really provide it to Canadians, as to why his government embarked on this massive expansion of immigration to begin with, when everything was telling them that this was not going to work. The fact, as you point out, that we didn't have the housing supply, that the infrastructure wasn't capable of handling this massive surge in our population. Do you have an do you have an idea as to why the government did this in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing. Like the explanation that's given is one thing. The actual motivation for it, or motivations, is another. Canada has always been, for the most part, very welcoming to large numbers of immigrants. Though it was hard to get the number up, um, to the point where we were able to, for instance, settle Western Canada, and to attract laborers to the resource industry and so forth. That's all covered in the introduction to my study. Um, However, there was better planning that went into it in the past, and the impetus was to, as I say, settle the land. Like, it was mostly empty. We had better hold on to it. People thought in the late 19th, early 20th century. Otherwise, the Americans are going to take it and settle it themselves. So that's not the position that we're in, even though the country is far from full. Places like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, they feel um, cramped, and there's a sense of scarcity and so forth. But that isn't the case universally throughout the country. But there aren't enough. There isn't enough infrastructure and jobs to go around everywhere, and everybody tends to settle in big cities in the first place. Okay, so put that to one side. Canada has not had a growing population under its own power since the late 1950s. We nevertheless built a welfare state that was predicated on a population that would for the most part, have more working aged people than retired people. Okay, that hasn't been the case for quite some time, and one of the solutions was to bring in working age people from abroad, and that seemed to make a lot of sense when numbers were, in the mid 20th century, when numbers were a little bit more manageable. There were labor shortages and plenty of space even in our big cities. Okay, that isn't the case anymore, um, and birth rates have fallen everywhere, not just in Canada. So we have an increasingly diminishing we have a diminishing population abroad of young, well educated persons to draw on to bring here. Okay, now that would ostensibly be the reason. Okay, that was ostensibly the reason to bring in people to work here, to contribute to the economy, and so forth. But that isn't what happened. What happened is that instead of the high wage, high skilled immigration that actually raises wages and productivity and makes the economy boom and so forth, the Trudeau years favored the lower end of our wages, the lower skill levels, and the result was a huge expansion of the temporary foreign worker program. Okay, we're talking multiple millions. Okay, and especially in things like the service industry, or famously, there's like the agriculture seasonal agricultural worker program. Like, that's not really controversial. What is controversial is your kids living in your basement because they can't get a job at Tim Hortons because uh, the management, or the company is using the TFWP as a business model to keep wages and prices low. Okay, that is that is what happened from about 2015 onward. It was massively expanded, and the result was, yes, we avoided a recession, but there's you know we're not that much better than that. It's sort of like a feeling of stagnancy and diminishing productivity per and diminishing GDP per capita. GDP went up, yes, a little bit, but per capita it went down.
It's incredible when you look at it that way, and you kind of put it into the perspective of a young Canadian who can't get an entry level job in a community in a suburb outside of a major city. And I keep going back to this idea that I feel as though Canada's response to what was happening would have been stronger and it would have come faster if we didn't grow up with this idea that criticizing immigration, voicing opposition to it, is something very un-Canadian.
Mhm.
And it allowed. Do you feel as though that kind of mentality, our general acceptance, which is definitely a positive thing when the system is working, but do you think that Canada's general attitude towards immigration was what allowed it to get to the point where it was before we finally started to really start speaking up and before the opinions of the country changed?
Yeah, it was, but it wasn't the only factor. I mean, I think that um, the when it comes to public policy questions, or what it is that Canadians are willing to tolerate, I think we are very patient in general. It isn't just the sacred, the supposedly sacred cow of immigration, but that area of public policy is particularly problematic because of the lack of public input, the lack of awareness. It's just extremely complex, first of all, but there's also just uh, a lack of public awareness of the sheer amount of power, the sheer power that many immigration officials have, that the minister has, and then the kind of uh, secretive way uh, levels are set numbers, overall numbers are goals of permanent residence and so forth are established. And there's nothing sinister or conspiratorial about it. It's just this is all done by cabinet. It doesn't happen out in the open in Parliament. And I don't know. I think that maybe the last time there was an immigration related consultation was, I don't know, in the middle of the 20th century. I mean, it's just we constructed a system that worked well, I would say, in the 60s, and it's run into problems since then. But because there was so much goodwill, patience, and confidence in general, I think we sort of we let it slide. And the world is also very different. I've talked about, I've talked about viewing immigration, the labor market, international fertility rates, and so forth as kind of like a system, right? And we haven't been doing that. When people talk about population, when they talk about demographics in Canada, for as long as I can remember, the end of the discussion has always been something like, oh well, we will still be able to maintain population growth because of immigration. Well, the question is now, from where? If you play this forward for long enough, there aren't going to be any countries this century that are above replacement. So we have a system that has lost public confidence, and I would argue is actually quite quickly becoming obsolete.
One of the things that I have argued and tried to wrap my head around during the past few years of the immigration system exploding into public consciousness is the idea that if you bring in such a large number of people from one particular country, and over the past few years, I look at India in particular, the expectation, the ability for them to integrate becomes much harder because of the fact that there are so many newcomers from one particular country.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really matter which country that is, but to try to integrate into the broader community when there is an influx of people from one particular background, that makes it harder. So, would it make sense for the country to try to limit or put caps on specific countries so that we get a more broad, intake from a more even intake from all countries if we're to continue doing this?
Well, this plays into exactly what I was just saying. We used to get a very different sort of pattern of immigration, right? And that was determined in large measure, not exclusively, but in large measure by which countries in the world had a surplus population within the sort of working age, um, the working age demographic, right? So once upon a time, that was Great Britain, and you can explain a huge amount of the urge to go and conquer the world uh, simply because they had such a large cohort of young men. Okay, there are increasingly fewer countries that have that sort of, if you look at the age pyramid, the demographic pyramid, that sort of bulge in the middle, right? India is one of the last, and their fertility is falling. It's falling fast, but for the past several years, there's one of the few countries that had that surplus population that was also well educated, mobile, um, and eager to seek their fortune abroad. Okay, so um, we can put aside any question of some kind of there's no conspiracy. It's not like a kind of secret plot. Demographics explain that. Okay, now we have a system that is meant and I'm referring to the points system, that is meant to choose people based entirely on skills. Okay, now um, we are choosing people for. We'll come to whether this works well or not, but I mean, for the most part, we are choosing people with skills. Okay, people who have been well educated, and so forth. Okay, but there are fewer and fewer and fewer countries that are going to be left that we're going to be able to draw from. Okay, so the point system needs to be tinkered with, rejigged, however you want to put it, to account for that. because we are entering a world in which we are going to be competing, if that's the way you want to look at it, we're going to be competing with other countries for a shrinking pool of skilled immigrants. Now, should we limit the countries? Well, I mean, this is the kind of question that the country ought to be having, that we don't, that we haven't had. What ended up happening over the past 10 years was that there was apparently such an emergency for higher and higher numbers of people to come here, that uh, skill levels, required skills were lowered. Standards for knowledge of English and French were lowered. Anything to get the numbers up. There was even a scandal that the uh, employment and social development um, people were the bureaucrats were instructed, not to not to pay too much attention to enforcement, just sort of get people into the country. Okay, this is just not going to work for us anymore. Not only has it broken the public trust, but it is economically bad. Like it just doesn't help our country. So, should we be looking at where there are where the last holdout of a well-educated younger population is in the world? Yeah, we probably should, but this is just one of many other questions that should be more public and that should involve a greater amount of transparency.
One of the things you talk about in the report is about Canadian values and how that is a major factor in the success of an immigration system. You reference some of the Nordic countries, their public campaigns, and what they're doing to ensure that their values are met and that there is more cohesion with the immigration system. Can you just explain briefly in more detail with the Canadian context how that might look in the future?
Well, one of the things that I think is noteworthy that's done abroad, and you mentioned the Nordic countries, I think Australia does something similar, or at least has done in the past, which is basically to discourage um, a lot of uh, would-be immigrants from coming if they have no intention of fitting in, or getting absorbed into the labor market and culture and so forth. Um, there was a lot of trouble in Australia with sort of bogus asylum claims and so forth, and there was quite a successful campaign to dissuade that. Okay, um, I think that I mean, this is first of all, it's about order, and we have seen a lot of quite disturbing protests that, whatever the motivation of the protesters, they are not observing our norms of public demonstrations and so forth. They are uh, tormenting people, harassing them, making holding demonstrations outside daycares and sort of Jewish retirement homes and so forth. I mean, there's just that. If that's your idea of how to hold a public protest, this is just not how it's done here, and we have laws that ought to be enforced there. So, um, first of all, if public order is not to be maintained, then you have a complete breakdown in trust on of the immigration system. It will bring the um, government itself into disrepute, and call into doubt the entire sort of the economic and cultural and every conceivable angle of the immigration system will suffer. And we've seen this. So dissuading people who don't want to fit in, or who think that there's some um, they just want to come here to go on benefits or welfare, what have you. That's one thing. The other would be a greater effort at both economic and cultural integration. One of the ways to deal with that is actually to select immigrants who have already been educated here. Again, that's an Australian. gold standard from Australia. I mean, if you can fit into and do reasonably well at a Canadian university and you've come from abroad, I mean, you fit in. I mean, there's no, I mean, there might be some small exceptions to that, but in general, I think that would be a good thing to favor. Now, to a certain extent, we already do that, but we should do it more. I mean, that should be a major, a much larger part of the acculturation process than it currently is. Now, people will respond, and they have responded to me, and they said, "Well, we kind of do a lot of this stuff already." Like, well, to a small extent, yes. I mean, I don't know about any campaigns to go and dissuade people. There are efforts, especially at the local level, to integrate immigrants. There are language schools. Those exist, obviously, yes. But clearly something is wrong when most Canadians are saying that we are not demanding enough. And this has become a chorus, like a refrain over the past several years. Now, we should probably try to probe that and find out exactly what it is that people think have gone wrong. Obviously, violent, angry public protests, I think, are turning people off even more than they might normally be. But this speaks again to the question of public consultation and transparency. We need a government that will take this more seriously, look into it, and do something.
Dr. Michael Bonner, I'll have to leave it there. Thank you for joining me on the show today. If you enjoyed that conversation and want to see more coverage on Canada's immigration system, let me know by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.